Okay, when you think of the UK, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Probably rain, right? Gray skies, lots of it. So, how on earth is it possible that a country famous for its dreary weather is facing a severe water crisis? I mean, we're talking about serious stuff here. Droughts, talk of rationing, and a financial meltdown of its entire water industry. It just doesn't add up.
Well, it's a huge paradox, and it pulls back the curtain on this incredible story of debt, dividends, and a massive gamble that was taken over 30 years ago. And guess what? That gamble is now coming due.
So, get this. More than 30 years after England and Wales sold off their water systems, some of the biggest companies are basically on the verge of collapse. They're just buried under this mountain of debt. But here's the thing. This isn't some brand new problem. To really get what's happening now, we've actually got to look back. Way back.
Yeah, you really have to see today's crisis as just the latest chapter in a much, much longer story. For centuries, who controls England's water has swung back and forth like a giant pendulum, from private companies to public authorities, with each side basically trying to fix the mess the other one made.
Okay, so let's talk about that first big swing of the pendulum. It all kicked off during the Industrial Revolution. You had cities just exploding in size, and the old public systems, things like town fountains and local wells, they just could not keep up. They were completely overwhelmed.
And Manchester's story here, it pretty much became the blueprint for the entire country. The population just surged, the wells got all contaminated, and the local government, they just didn't have the cash to fix it. So what happened? Well, Parliament stepped in and authorized a private company to take over. The thinking was, hey, private enterprise is the only way we can fund these huge infrastructure projects. And pretty soon, by the mid-1800s, private companies were running the whole show.
But, and this is a big but, this first big experiment with privatization, it was an absolute disaster. The companies, naturally, were focused on profits, not people. They underinvested in critical infrastructure, and they were pumping contaminated water from polluted rivers right into people's homes. The result? A public health catastrophe. Seriously. This dirty water led to all sorts of deadly diseases, and everyone was pointing the finger right at the private companies.
Now this is where it gets really interesting. A physician, Dr. William Farr, started collecting actual data on this, like real statistics on death rates, and what he found was just shocking. Back in 1840, the general mortality rate was a staggering 2.2%. That's more than double what it is today, and it was way, way higher in the towns. The connection was just undeniable. Dirty water from these private companies was literally killing people.
And this is what happened next. You guessed it? The pendulum swung right back the other way. In 1851, Manchester's City Council just took over its failing private water company, and the results were, well, they were immediate and they were dramatic. Look at these numbers. Water supply per person just skyrocketed. The number of homes with piped water more than tripled. And here's a cool side effect. Because the water pressure was finally high enough, it was way more effective at fighting fires. This model was so successful that by World War I, 80% of Britain's water was back in public hands. The swing was complete.
So, this public model worked pretty well for decades. But then, we get to the 1980s, and a whole new set of problems pops up. Under Margaret Thatcher, a totally different way of thinking took over. The government started arguing that the big, regional public water authorities were just too bureaucratic. They claimed they couldn't raise the money needed to meet these strict new water quality standards coming from the European Union. And their solution? Yep, privatization. Again.
Now, to make sure this massive sale actually worked, the government made the deal incredibly sweet for investors. I mean, ridiculously sweet. First, they just wiped the slate clean, forgave all $5 billion of existing debt. Gone. Then they gave the new companies a $1.5 billion cash gift. They called it a green dowry. And on top of all that, they basically ordered the companies to raise their prices significantly. It was a deal that was literally designed to be irresistible.
And it's really important to point out, this only happened in England and Wales. For various political reasons, Scotland and Northern Ireland kept their water systems in public hands, and they still are today. That little fact becomes super relevant when you compare how the two systems have done over the last 30 years.
So, okay, the deal is done. What were the long-term consequences? Well, for the next 3 decades, a very specific financial model took hold, and it was one that prioritized paying back shareholders over long-term investment in the system itself. And that leads us directly to the crisis we're seeing today.
All right, so here's the absolute crucial point.
When these companies were privatized, they started with zero debt, a clean slate. Today, the whole sector is drowning in over £60 billion of debt. I mean, they've gone from being financially healthy to having 4 times more debt than equity. It's insane. So, where did all that money go? Well, a huge chunk of it went right here. We're talking somewhere between 75 and 85 billion pounds paid out in dividends to shareholders. And to pay for these massive payouts, what did they do? They took on huge loans, basically using you, the stable, bill-paying customer, as collateral. This strategy just loaded the companies with debt while sucking all the value out for investors.
This debt-heavy model also created this awful boom-bust cycle for investment. And a lot of this is driven by the regulator, a body called Ofwat. See, Ofwat reviews prices every 5 years. And to keep your bills down, which sounds good, right? It often pushes companies to cut their spending. So investment drops until a crisis hits, like a huge drought. Then suddenly, everyone panics and there's a spike in spending. But as soon as the immediate danger is over, it drops off again. It's a completely reactive way to run things, not proactive.
And the real-world costs of this up and down cycle, they're pretty stark. Get this, the country hasn't built a major new reservoir in over 30 years. A huge part of the pipe network is ancient. We're talking Victorian-era pipes, which means massive leaks everywhere. And because the infrastructure is failing, really serious pollution incidents like sewage overflows have just surged.
So, how did this toxic mix of massive debt and crumbling infrastructure lead us to where we are right now? Well, today, it has pushed several of these companies right to the edge of financial collapse.
To really understand the risk here, you just need to know one key term. It's called the gearing ratio. It's actually pretty simple. It's just a way to measure how much debt a company has compared to its own money, its equity. The higher that ratio, the riskier things are.
And this chart, this shows you just how bad things have gotten. The regulator, Ofwat, starts to get worried when that number goes over 60%. And as you can see, several companies are way past that mark. But the real outlier here is Thames Water. It's the country's biggest water company, and it has a staggering 88% gearing ratio. They're in serious financial trouble, and they're struggling to raise the cash they need to fix their own crumbling network.
Which brings us to a really fascinating question that was raised in the source material. We call this a privatized, market-based system. But think about it. If the regulator controls the prices, approves the debt levels, and sets the quality standards, what is actually being left to the market? Is it really a market at all, or is it something else entirely?
The core argument here is that England has basically ended up with the worst of both worlds. It doesn't have the long-term strategic planning you'd get from a truly public system, but it also doesn't have the real risk and reward discipline of a free market. Instead, what you've got is this super complex, fragmented system that's all driven by these short-term, 5-year cycles, and that makes it almost impossible for anyone to properly plan for the next 10, 20, or even 30 years.
So, when you look at it all, the UK's water crisis is just this powerful, real-world case study of the dangers of privatizing essential public services. It's a story about a system that's been swinging back and forth for 2 centuries, and a regulatory model that just seems completely incapable of planning for the future. So the ultimate question isn't just, will the pendulum swing back again? It's a bigger question. Is it even possible to build a system that can actually handle the storms and the droughts that we know are coming?